This week's portion begins with divine approval of a deeply troubling act. Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron the high priest, kills an Israelite man and a Midianite woman in a moment of zealous fury. He does so alone, impulsively, in response to their flagrant public act of defiance of God's will. Torah tells us that his act on behalf of righteousness turned back God's wrath from the Israelites. Pinchas is rewarded with a brit shalom, a covenant of peace, and he's also granted priesthood. As a child of parents who witnessed firsthand the violence of injustice and of the war meant to counter it, I was raised to believe that peace and justice should be of ultimate concern for absolutely everyone. Coming of age in the 60s and 70s, amidst the Vietnam War and struggles for civil rights and environmental protections and gender equality, I learned early on that passivity is not an option in response to sufferings of injustice. Justice and peace must be zealously sought, must be generated, must be balanced somehow, must be protected by each person in each generation. I learned very quickly how complicated and painful that work can be, especially when justice is sought through violence, or when distant conflicts create conflict closer to home in our families and in our communities. So when I read that Pinchas is rewarded for his act of religiously motivated violence, I find it hard to breathe, because we live in a world overwhelmed by violence. Some of it is justified by religion. There is so much pain, in any case, so much pain related to all of this, pain that is hidden, that remains untold, that is carried quietly in the secret chambers of so many hearts and minds. Suffering and grief are rampant in this world. So what is this ancient story telling us, asking of us as inheritors of Torah, as inheritors of covenant? Rashi taught that Pinchas acted leshem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, that the ends justify the means. This is a popular interpretation. Others, like the Netziv of Volochin, noticed that the word shalom in Brit Shalom is written out in the Torah scrolls with a broken letter Vav. The Vav, the letter that connects, the letter that serves as a bridge, as a nail, linking one sound, one letter, one word, one idea to the next. Avraham v'Sarah, Lador Vador, Adonai v'Adam. And yet here, in this story, and nowhere else, that letter is broken. It presents as a wound in the letter that symbolizes connection more than anything else, in the word that means peace. So I have to ask why. Maybe because a long ago pacifist scribe was startled or offended by the idea that Pinchas should receive a reward. Maybe because they made an error or they had a deficit of ink. Maybe because each subsequent scribe repeated that aberration. Who knows? The mystical teachings of Lurianic Kabbalism link the soul of Pinchas with the soul of Cain, suggesting that Pinchas inherited Cain's destructive, violent zeal. The Zohar asserts that Pinchas and the prophet Elijah may either be the same person or just share the same soul, because their tendencies and their intertwined destinies, according to this tradition, serve to guide the wise away from violent zealotry toward other options. In this view, the Brit Shalom can't be a reward for zealotry. It is a divine attempt to redirect Pinchas's inherited passions for violence towards something else, toward holiness. It's no accident that this story appears in a portion about inheritances. The daughters of Zelophehad demand their rightful inheritance. Moses advocates for them and later gives attention to his own legacy. I see this context of inheritance as an invitation to us to consider what we inherit and pass along. What values, what wounds, what patterns, what traumas, what responsibilities do we take for granted and enact impulsively without paying attention to the consequences, to the wounds that often result? Pinchas inherits both a priestly lineage and a moment of crisis. How he responds has long-lasting implications, and I have to say, the same is true for us. We live in a time of deep division. Just as the Israelites in the wilderness faced moral confusion, we too face polarization, extremism, rhetoric, and regulations that empower some to commit violences that, well, for those of us who are not necessarily directly affected, can still be troublesome and so hard to live with. Some people say, if only we were more decisive, more forceful, more zealous, then we could restore moral clarity, and then we could finally achieve peace. But I read the Pinchas story differently. I read it as a warning that zeal alone is not enough to create justice, to herald in a lasting peace. More often, this kind of zeal leaves wounds that, like that broken letter Vav, are carried forward through generations, Lador Vador. Fast forward to Parshat Matot, which opens tellingly with a focus on vows, words that can build or destroy, just like weapons. God instructs Moses to wage war against, guess who? The Midianites. And Moses gathers 12,000 soldiers, 1,000 from each tribe, to be led by none other than, starts with a P, Pinchas. Pinchas the priest. Pinchas now officially dedicated to holiness, and so he does not carry a spear. He is expected to carry sacred vessels and trumpets. Now, the text automatically goes on to all the war stuff that happens, but I feel moved to pause, to set my imagination to the dust and tension of that moment of preparing for war. I imagine Pinchas receiving the news that he is being called into the fray and onto the battlefield, not as a warrior, but as a priest. He is not to act alone. He is not to act on impulse. He doesn't even carry a weapon. I imagine him in that moment, dumbstruck, panicking, turning to God and asking, well, how do I do this? I don't know how to do this. How do I hold space for what is to come without a weapon, without a spear? I'm not cut out for this. I imagine him terrified, because this moment demands something different of him. Not the zeal with which he is familiar, but presence, holiness. He is called to stand in the midst of violence, to hold sacred space for everything that will unfold, the cries of the victors and the cries of the dying. The Israelites' zeal for divine justice and the Midianites' desperation for their own lives. Pinchas is called to bear sacred witness to all of it. And I imagine him weeping, because he knows what many of these soldiers do not know, namely that even righteous violence can wound the soul. Pinchas learned the hard way that righteous violence, that justice requires more than impulses, more than personal conviction or defenses. It requires humility. It requires compassion and the courage to be vulnerable, to be spearless. This time, his task is not to fight. It is to carry sacred vessels, to remind the people in their zeal what this is all supposed to be about, namely our movements as a people toward holiness. This feels deeply relevant to me. Our world is full of challenges: anti-Semitism, racism, war, climate crisis. Many of us respond with outrage, with moral panic, and many still hold to the idea that the end justifies the means, and I don't know, maybe. But even so, I find that hard to live with. It's not an easy answer. It does not leave me feeling peaceful. In grappling with the story of Pinchas, I find myself drawn to the idea that there may be something else to consider as we face today's challenges: the role of courageous vulnerability, humility, moral clarity amidst all the noise and all the dust, amidst all the sufferings, a willingness to set aside self-righteousness and personal agendas and our own defensiveness, to enter the fray, not with panic, but with presence. The story of the broken Vav and these times that we live in, I think, demand that we, all of us, look to the wounds, that we pay attention to the wounds, all of them. More and more of us are recognizing, for example, that it is possible to advocate for Israel and condemn violence against non-Hamas Palestinians and Muslims. But none of this is easy. It is messy. Of course it is messy, just like it was messy for our ancestors, but this is the holy work that we are all called to. Guided by the later Pinchas, I want us to be able to choose thoughtful and faithful action over moral panic. I want us to be able to respond not by stoking fear or by arming ourselves, but by holding sacred space for one another on all of today's battlefields. Looking at the evolution of Pinchas from warrior to priest, I do believe that it is possible to change, to learn from the past, and to be present to the present of the present for the sake of the future. Wouldn't that be a great legacy for us to leave the next generation? There is nothing that feels more relevant to me right now than the troubling connection between violence and peace and the call to righteousness, the call to holiness. Because I am an inheritor, a carrier of stories of pain, of wounds and responsibilities that preceded my birth, and I know I'm not alone. That is true for all of us. I grew up believing that it is possible to know just by looking at someone who is righteous and who is not righteous, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. And I was determined to position myself on the right side of things, but these days it is so hard to know. Where is that side? Things feel so much more complicated these days than they were, and in part because they really are. In part because I'm less naive. I've had to reckon with the history of my lineage, the history of this country, as well as of my own impulses. And in addition to that, there is so much conflicting and distracting and terrifying information and misinformation swirling around us right now. How do we even know what to bring to this world, what to be outraged about today? How do we know what to bring to the battlefield? I ask myself in response, well, where am I tempted to act impulsively, convinced that I'm in the right, convinced that I hold the full truth? I ask myself where I benefit from a sacred pause. Can I pause to consider what I have inherited and what I am passing along? A pause so I can turn to God for other options, options other than violence of word, thought, or deed. Where am I called to set aside the spear and carry into the fray something different, something sacred? What would that be? What would that look like? What would it feel like? Would it make a difference? And more than that, can I act and live without assurance that it will, that it'll go my way? Suffering and grief abound in this world. I feel that broken vav inside myself, and I see it in our communities. I see it in my own family. Justice and peace feel so elusive, like a distant dream, absolutely irreconcilable. So much feels broken. So if I must enter the fray, and I know I must, I hope that it will be like Pinchas the priest, with sacred vessels and instruments, because I am not a political strategist, and there is so much I can't know. But I do know this, I do know and I trust this, that learning from the past and turning to God in vulnerability in the present is not weakness. I opt to interpret the broken vav not as a reward, and probably not even as a divine redirection, but as an invitation to be present, to hold complexity, to question, to grieve, and ultimately to do the work of the vav, connecting acts with consequences, connecting the broken pieces. Perhaps that is what is required for us to be true and worthy inheritors and partners in the Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace given to Pinchas. Be the vav, be the bridge, be the nail, and be the heart that connects. Shabbat Shalom.
Yashar Kochech, what an honor for us to learn from you. It was a very beautiful and important drush.